All right, hello everyone. This is the second PowerPoint, History 173, PowerPoint 1B. And in this PowerPoint, we're going to be discussing the end of Reconstruction and the sort of narrative of how Reconstruction comes into being and then how it ends around 1877 and the aftermath right after that. And again, just sort of trying to think about what the major themes and ideas coming from this period in U.S. history are, how it relates to the end of the American Civil War, and also how it sets up the next 70 to 80 years of American history, particularly in terms of issues related to civil rights and voting rights and issues of equality and racial and ethnic tension and strife that emerge out of the end of Reconstruction and the Reconstruction period itself. So let's get right to the second of the slides of the PowerPoint itself on the end of Reconstruction. Here is another map for us to look at. This is a map of the United States just a couple years after the map that we had looked at earlier from around 1865. And you can see the areas that are bolded off there in yellow, which are the states that are being reconstructed and readmitted into the United States after the period of the American Civil War, these states that had seceded from the Union. And you can see the dates here, 1870, 1868. These are all the dates that these states were actually readmitted into the United States after the end of the American Civil War, and all the sets of issues that relate to that. You can again see that this territory here, that's quote the Oklahoma Territory, or the quote Indian Territory, not the term we would use today, but that's what it was called then, not yet a state. And then these other areas that are in blue, which are also are not states. And then of course all the different states that do not have their names on them are the states that are they're already members of the United States and did not have to be admitted to the United States. And did not succeed. Obviously, they were the part of the Union or the federal part of the United States that continued to fight on the side of the United States during the American Civil War. Okay, so again, we can see this map is in process, and these issues are changing and transforming in the 1860s as the United States is reconstructing itself. Moving on now, let's talk about the end of Reconstruction. Remember, this is a period. Reconstruction is this period, this about 15-year period from 1865 to 1880. It's a period, but it's also a process, right? And the ways that we try to understand it is that there's this attempt to reconstruct the United States and understand it understand this new reality of having all of these states where slavery was no longer legal. But a very, very serious and problematic sets of issues are going to develop. One of the biggest problems is that the president who had brought the United States through the war, through the American Civil War, and was an incredibly fine president, both in terms of his political leadership, but also his political acumen, his political power, his ability to sort of assess what was the most important, and that, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. He's assassinated, about a week after the end of the American Civil War by the Southern actor John Wilkes Booth. And his death, he dies the next morning after being assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. while he's watching a play. And this leads his vice president, who actually was a Southerner, who came from a different political background than him, on a bipartisan ticket in 1864. And Andrew Johnson himself used to be a slave owner, and he just comes at this whole set of issues that the United States is facing in Reconstruction from a completely different point of view, from a completely different perspective. And he was completely ineffective, not popular as president, not effective. And he's going to be important for a variety of reasons, the first of which is that he is the first American president in the history of the American executive branch to be impeached. To be impeached does not mean that you are found guilty, as we just, of course, found out relatively recently with the issues related to President Trump. It means that you are actually, a set of charges are brought against you, and then there is a trial to see if you are found guilty or not, and then of course the process goes forward and has to be involving both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so Andrew Johnson was the first president to actually be impeached. It was not a really legitimate claim against him, but the attempt to actually convict him and to impeach him and to force him from office came very, very close. And it was to succeeding. It was a political battle between President Johnson and the Congress over a variety of issues related to Reconstruction. And of course, Johnson is the first president to be impeached. He almost lost the vote, very, very close. Bill Clinton, President Clinton from the 1990s, is the second to be impeached. He survives the process. And of course, sometimes students want to say that, oh yeah, there was one president, who actually was impeached and then found guilty, and then he resigned, and that was President Nixon, Richard Nixon, who remains the only president to have resigned after the whole Watergate controversy, which we will talk about at the very end of this class. But Nixon did not wait to be impeached. He knew that he probably was going to be impeached and found guilty, that he did not have enough votes in the House and in the Senate to survive that process. And so he actually resigned because of the whole set of issues and controversies related to Watergate before he actually even became formally impeached. So Nixon is not correct. It is not correct to say that Nixon actually was impeached. He was not impeached. He just resigned. And Johnson was impeached and was almost found guilty, but survived the vote and went on to be president till the end of his term in 1868. Now, one of the issues and groups that he had problems with was this set of radical Republicans. That's their terminology. It was a section of the Republican Party that had been originally very committed to the emancipation of the slaves, and then formed this coalition that became very powerful, particularly in the 5 years right after the end of the American Civil War, trying to push forward a very progressive platform of ideas that put people into power, particularly put a variety of Republicans into power in the South in the post Civil War period, and very, very problematic on a variety of levels, mostly because they received such pushback from Southern Democrats who did not want these radical Republicans to come into office. Some of these radical Republicans were newly freed slaves, former slaves. And there's all sorts of issues involving this radical Republican part of the Republican Party in the late 1860s. They were attempting to push forward their attempts at enfranchising African Americans, of putting forth their vision of what the new political reality of the United States should be. And they did come to power in a variety of positions and places in the immediate aftermath of the end of the American Civil War. But within about 5, and even at the later parts of it, 10 years, they themselves are going to be pushed from power. And that is going to lead into the sort of coming back into power of Southern white Democrats from the Democratic Party of the 19th century, and sort of this re-legitimization of issues related to racial difference and not respecting the newly created rights of newly freed slaves, of African Americans in the post 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment periods, which really brings about the failure of Reconstruction, the sad, very difficult part of Reconstruction that does not actually fully reconstruct the United States along the lines of liberty and equality, which is one of the big stories of this History 173 class, is the ways that the United States struggles with issues of race and ethnicity, and let's be honest, continues to struggle with issues of race and ethnicity, partly because of some of these issues that happen in the 19th century at the end of the American Civil War. All right, so Reconstruction is taking place. Johnson is the former vice president of Lincoln. He becomes president in 1865 after Lincoln is assassinated. He is not a very effective leader. He has nowhere near the strength that Lincoln had. and he is eventually impeached, but is found not guilty by a very small amount of the votes, and has tensions with these radical Republicans who are attempting to create change both in the North and the South at the end of the American Civil War period as the U.S. moves into Reconstruction. Okay, let's move on to the fourth slide here, and that is going to lead us to the coming of a new president in 1868, and this is a president who most people know, but mostly because of the fact that he was a very famous general, and he was the leader of the American troops of the federal troops during the Civil War itself. And this is Ulysses S. Grant, former Union War hero, as it says there. He decides to run for the presidency. Johnson decides he's not going to run again. He is from New York State. He runs on the Republican ticket, and he is elected president in 1868 and in 1872. So he serves 2 full terms. He was a very strong and wonderful, of course, this is a photograph of Grant here on the right of Ulysses Grant, this photograph of him sitting there with his legs crossed. And he was a very strong military leader, a very strong general, but not a very strong president, and a relatively weak and ineffective president, not as ineffective as Johnson, perhaps, but certainly nowhere near the match of Lincoln in terms of the power of the presidency and the power to actually get effective political work done. And so this leads to the beginning of a period of about 20 to 30 years of really serious lack of political leadership. This is what historians who study this period, says that sort of the beginning of what becomes known as the do-nothing presidents. That's the term, the do-nothing presidents, because they really didn't do very much. And the presidency sort of suffers during this period of sort of a lack of political imagination and political leadership, beginning with Johnson, but continuing through Grant, and then going all the way really to the end of the 19th century. And most of the presidential leaders, of the politicians who become president of the United States from the 1870s through the 1890s were very weak, and lots of them were plagued by corruption scandals. And we're going to talk about this when we get into the Gilded Age material related to the Age of Innocence. And this becomes a really very difficult period of uncertainty politically for the United States, with the coming of Grant to be president, and of course, sort of the aftermath of the issues related to his presidency and the sets of concerns that come out of that. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and then we'll finish off the last slide in a shorter video, just to make sure we actually get through all sections of the videos, and the last section of this video will come in just a minute. So we'll stop here.